So thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for coming out on a cold and wintry night. It's amazing that so many people have actually braved the weather. So we have a session now to talk and to listen, and then we're going to go and have, for the people who are here, we're going to have sort of more drinks and networking afterwards. So tonight, the first thing I'd like to do is wish you all a happy International Women's Day. So fantastic. And to celebrate that, we've got two fantastic speakers. So first off, we have Professor Avril Mansfield, who everyone will know, and who has been the toast of the town recently in the last few weeks. It's been hard to avoid her on Women's Hour, BBC Manchester this morning, and even Radio 6 Music. And the reason for that is her fantastic book, which I'm not being paid to promote this, but it's really good. So I've read it at the weekend. It's an excellent book, Life in Her Hands. I brought my copy because I wanted to sign it. So we're going to get her to come up and speak to us. Come up, Professor Mansfield. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
So,
Avril,
if I may.
With one voice, we say Avril.
So, you're the first professor of surgery who's a woman in the UK.
Yes, indeed.
And you're the first vascular surgeon. And reading your book, there's it's just wonderful how enthusiastic you've been about surgery from the beginning.
Yes.
And the story that stays in my mind is that you operated on your teddy bear when you were about 8.
I know.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it was a panda for a start, so let's get that. And I wish I still had it. I think, gosh, what happened to that wonderful panda? But it certainly did get its appendix removed, which was it. Numerous times I'd make this incision. I knew roughly where the right incision was, but... and then I'd take it out and I'd stuff it back in again and do it all over again.
It's a great start.
Great start to my career. Yes.
And then just sort of, I can't summarise the whole book. I can totally sort of encourage everyone to read it. But you sort of write in a chronological way and you take us through your beginnings and how, as was brought out on Women's Hour, originally the newspaper said you wanted to be a nurse, but you were
indeed
incensed because your
that was my mother's doing. Yes. Yes.
You always knew you wanted to be a doctor and even a surgeon.
There was nothing odd about that because I was delivered into the world by a female doctor. My school doctor was female and I thought she was lovely. I liked her a lot. So I couldn't see any reason why I shouldn't be a doctor. And I'd kind of fallen in love with the idea of surgery. So put the two together and I'm clearly going to be a surgeon, that's for sure. And it stuck with me for thereafter. I never really varied. I mean, I kept it quiet when I went to medical school because you don't brag about the fact that you think you're going to be a surgeon when you go to medical school, and I was struggling anyway. The book tells you that I failed second MB, so no secrets at all about that. But, you know, it was clearly what I wanted to do, and it's been such a happy career for me. I'm so lucky that it just worked out. How would I know? How does anybody know? But it did. It worked out brilliantly for me.
It struck me that, you know, if I ask you, and I've asked you this in the past, you know, have you met any barriers? Have you had any discrimination? You've always said that you haven't.
Yep.
And yet some of the things you describe in the book, I think some people might take as discrimination. You're being referred to as a slip of a girl.
Yes.
And other areas when people are sort of saying, what are you going to be the surgeon?
Yes.
So describe that bit. It's not discrimination, it's just the otherness of being a surgeon, being a woman in that era.
Yes, I mean, I think I summed up my feelings about it by saying that the first time I got in an aeroplane and heard over the loudspeaker, "This is your pilot speaking," and it was a female voice, I was quite shocked. I mean, I thought, my God, I'm going to be flown across the Atlantic by a woman. And then, come on, you know, for heaven's sake, you of all people should understand. So I always felt that it was a matter of people getting used to the idea, because let's face it, it was largely, almost entirely men who were the surgeons. So people took time to get used to it. And I thought if you could inject a bit of humour into it, then you could diffuse a lot of these difficult situations. And I've always done that throughout my life. I've always tried to diffuse a difficult situation by converting it from something miserable into something with a bit of a laugh at the end of it. It doesn't always work, but it's worth a try.
And when it came to being a professor of surgery, you didn't just walk into that job. The book describes that that was a careful balancing act. And you kept saying no, actually.
I did. Yeah. I didn't want, I mean, the story is that I was on the selection committee for the new professor of surgery. The professor of surgery, Pierre Guillou, went back to Leeds, and I was heartbroken because he was a really good professor of surgery. I wanted him to stay, but I knew that if Leeds became vacant, he would go. And so I was on the selection committee to appoint his successor, and we simply failed to make an appointment. I had absolutely no interest whatsoever in becoming the professor of surgery. It was the last thing I actually wanted. And when at about 8 o'clock I was still in my office catching up on the day, and the phone rang to say, we'd like you to be the professor of surgery, I just laughed. I mean, I thought it was just ridiculous. And I kept on doing that. And the other interesting feature about that is that I'd forgotten that I had kept a diary of those first 6 months, because it was a fraught time. It's probably the most fraught time of my life, actually, with those first few months of becoming a professor. Because it was disputed whether or not I was appropriate to be a professor. Very much disputed by certain people, you know.
And possibly you as well?
But of course me, yes. Me, perhaps number one, really.
Okay.
But it was very interesting that I'd kept this diary, because, and it makes you realise that memory is not totally accurate, and yet my diary written each day, I think, was accurate. So that was really very helpful. There were some people, for example, take Professor Hugh Dudley, who was always regarded as quite a difficult person. And if you'd asked me, without me having a diary, whether he'd be nice about me becoming his successor once removed, I'd have said, of course he wasn't nice about it. But he was. He actually came to my office and said, the hospital are all behind you. They want you to succeed. This is a great appointment. And had I not written it in my diary, I would have kind of gone away thinking he couldn't have possibly been in favour. But he was. So that was useful. So, you know, I haven't kept a diary all my life. I hope some of you maybe do. It's quite good if you can. I'm a sort of sporadic diary keeper. When something really important happens, you know, then I write it down.
You keep notes.
I've always written little bits of notes, and they're fairly haphazard, but still, there we are. Yeah. But, you know, becoming a professor was not my ideal job.
Yes, it sounds very hard work, how you describe it. You were trying to run 3 jobs, 4 jobs at once.
Yeah, I mean, the person I was succeeding, Pierre Guillou, had given a lecture at the Royal Society of Medicine maybe a couple of months before he finished working at St Mary's. And he described the impossibility of the job. So I knew it was an impossible job. I mean, I understood it completely. I didn't want it. And the things I liked, core to my whole enjoyment of surgery, has been the patient. Second core to my enjoyment of surgery has been the trainee. So those are the 2 major bits of my life. And you know, I could see myself being dragged away from the first, perhaps not so much from the second, but certainly I could see the patients would have to maybe take a back seat. So I didn't want that. I really didn't. So in the end, I managed to kind of keep all things rolling for 5 years, which is how long I did it for. Yeah.
So, getting on from that, moving on from that, we'll come back to that. But you then decided to start the Women in, you know, as it was, WIST, Women in Surgical Training, in 1991. Yeah. And in the book, so now, you know, it's 30 years plus since that, you know, as we are here, the Women in Surgery group has existed. 30 triumphant years, really, from when you've seen, you know, women in surgery becoming the absolute minority, with 3%, I think, in that year you started. with a 300% increase.
Yes.
Still only 13%, but still sounds better when you say it that way.
Yes. Yes.
But we are more numerous and it is more normal. And a lot of that is down to what you started. So it feels normal now to have this group, but how did you start it and what opposition did you meet?
Well, in all truth, it was becoming obvious that unless we did something about encouraging women to think about surgery as a career, we were going to be short of surgeons, because it was approaching 50% undergraduates. It wasn't at that time there, but it was clearly going to become 50%, and it's now more than 50%. And the statistics tell you that if we don't encourage more than 2 to 3% of women to think about that as a career, surgery as a career, then we're going to be short of surgeons. And it would have been so, I think, had we not tried to foster that thinking process. And I think that's what this was all about, really, was trying to bring the idea that it's not crazy to think about a woman becoming a surgeon. It's perfectly okay. In fact, it makes a lot more logic than men becoming surgeons now I think about it. But I'm not supposed to say that, am I?
It's all right, nobody's listening.
But it was necessary, and in a way it was a surprise to me that it took off as well as it did. I remember the very first meeting thinking that probably we'd have about 20 people in the room, and it was something like 200, I think, the very first meeting, and I was totally shocked by the fact that there were so many people out there who actually would feel that this was beneficial for them to actually meet other people who had done this career and who thought it was okay and quite normal and to be encouraged and to be helped. And that's really what this organisation is all about. It's not trying to discriminate in favour of women as opposed to men, not at all. Men are very welcome, very welcome. I'm sure you agree.
Absolutely.
But it is to make sure that the women are not disadvantaged by the fact that they seem to think that it's for the men, and it's not. It's for everybody. And it's a beautiful career for women to take up. I mean, it's just a lovely thing to do. It has all the bits, in my humble opinion, of a really good career. How lucky we are that we chose it. And sometimes it's a hard taskmaster, of course it is. Sometimes it's going to make you go away and tear your hair out and weep and wail. But overall, it has all the elements that make it into an interesting and happy career. And it's been great for me.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
The opposition you had setting it up, though, you didn't just sort of come up with the idea and everyone said, what a great idea. There was some opposition. It
wasn't tremendous opposition. I mean, I think it was more a sort of almost a cynicism that, do we really need this? And aren't we going to be flooded by babies and things in the college and all that, you know?
Right.
But you know, it was opposition that was not that difficult to overcome. It wasn't really... I mean, Terence English, now when he looks back on it, remembers it with rose-tinted spectacles as his...
That's what I was wondering.
His big idea.
That's what I was wondering. Okay.
Yes. I'm saying no more about that. But are you listening, Terence?
And do you think, so just thinking sort of for people who are in that position, perhaps the position you were in when you were trying to decide whether to take up the professorial post or not, you knew it was going to be hard. But you say in the book, there's one moment when you realised, or perhaps you realised in retrospect, that actually you were also going to be a role model doing that.
Yeah.
And did that, what would you say to women sort of in the room, many of whom are famous surgeons, and women listening online,
yes,
when they're faced with a similar decision?
I think you do have to consider that, and I think I should have thought about that more seriously at the time. It was just I was so opposed to the whole idea of it, but it is important. For example, it's important to see people who are vice-chancellors of universities, people who are chairing committees that are influential committees, that there are women playing their part equally with the men, sharing those responsibilities out equally, so that the younger women see that it's absolutely normal and there isn't anything odd about it, and everybody can achieve what it is that they have within themselves to achieve. That's the most important thing, is that we actually have the opportunities to achieve what we're capable of. Nobody can do more than that, can they? So, but to have the role models there, and there are plenty of them in this room tonight, and I, acknowledge that, which is wonderful, lots of them. It's really important that we see them and celebrate them.
Thank you very much, Professor Mansfield.
Welcome.
We are going to have a Women in Surgery book, which is going to be an amalgamation of people's stories, either long stories or little short anecdotes or even one-liners. And so everyone who's joined up online and has joined tonight, will send you round the email address, but please get thinking. We're also going to invite sort of our new famous author, Avril Mansfield, to write a section for that book. So the next section tonight is my pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Rhea Liang, who has come all the way from the Gold Coast of Australia. Professor Liang is a breast surgeon and is proud of her breast service she has set up on the Gold Coast. And the other thing that she's proud about is she has been involved with setting up and running the Operate with Respect programme that the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons has set up and been running for now, since 2015, hasn't it been? So there's a lot we've got to learn, both from that and also about your work with gender equity across the board. We're delighted to welcome you. We look very much forward to hearing your address. Thank you, Professor Liang. FRCS England now as well.
I mean, for those of you who weren't at the convocation, as we call it in Australia this afternoon, I actually got to say my perennial line, "It's crochet." Anyways, so I'd like to dedicate my presentation today to the ordinariness of being a woman surgeon. And that may seem like an odd thing to say, but let me tell you about the first time I met Dame Claire Marks. It was at the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons annual scientific congress in 2016, which was being held in Brisbane, Australia. And Claire was attending in her role as the president of the Royal College of Surgeons England and had already delivered the opening oration as well as a plenary presentation. At the time, I was a younger fellow and I admired her greatly from afar, but I was too much in awe of her to actually introduce myself to her in person. So now, some of you know that I take my crochet to surgical conferences, and that's because I'm neurodiverse and my attention's better if I can keep my hands busy. There's actually good science behind this, as being required to sit still causes motor overflow, and channeling this overflow into low cognitive motor activity improves attention, and this is why, even for those who aren't neurodiverse, we tend to doodle or spin pens or fidget. And now it's taken me many years to become sufficiently confident to weather the strange looks and remarks that crocheting causes in surgical settings because, of course, the traditional gender mix in surgery is such that fidgeting is far more socially acceptable than crocheting, even though the movements are actually very similar and only one of them produces baby blankets. So nowadays, of course, that I'm quite senior, I just sail on. But back then, I wasn't quite so confident. I'd only pull it out when the lights were dimmed. So on about the third day of this conference... Sorry, dirty mate. Yeah, all right. I'd only pull out my crochet when the lights were dimmed. So on about the third day of this conference, I arrived about 5 minutes late to one of these sessions, and I poked my head into the door of what I thought was the conference room, only to realise that I'd actually poked my head in the front of the conference room. And everyone was staring at me instead of the speaker. And so, burning with embarrassment, I withdrew and scuttled around to the door at the back and slid with burning cheeks into the back row as unobtrusively as I could. And then After a few minutes, after the burning of the cheeks had settled and the heart rate was down, I took out my crochet so that I could concentrate. And just as I was getting settled, someone entered from the back of the room and I heard their footsteps coming closer to me. And of course, there's that terrible feeling. You're like, please don't sit next to me, please don't sit next to me. And then a woman's voice with a British accent said, could you move over one seat? And I looked up and it was the Dame Claire Marks. And I was, as you might imagine, fangirling wildly, but too stunned to say a word. So I moved over one seat and she sat down, and then ignoring the glances of everyone around us, she said, oh, what lovely crochet. I'm glad you bring it to conferences. And then we both sat there side by side and watched the rest of the presentation. Now, if you know anything about conference conventions around, how distinguished guests always sit in the front row, and how we mind our own business when we're sitting next to strangers, and the aforementioned how we, behave in male-normed conferencey ways and fidget instead of crocheting, you'll understand how many barriers Claire smashed with those few simple actions and words. And you'll understand how choosing to sit in the back row rather than the front flattened the hierarchy, and how her simple comments made me, someone junior who she'd never met before, entirely normal in that surgical space. Both me and the hook and the yarn in my hands. So she was making me completely ordinary. Now, it's a privilege to be ordinary in a space, because to be ordinary means that you're so normalised that it does not require additional comment. To belong so much that work arrangements are fashioned to fit around your needs and not that of a different stereotyped norm. To be true to yourself at work, and to simultaneously be considered a good fit at the job, for the job at hand because of that truth, not in spite of that truth. There has, of course, been a relatively narrow segment of society that has enjoyed that privilege of being entirely ordinary in surgical spaces. And until that moment when I met Claire, I had not myself ever felt very ordinary in surgical spaces. And I must admit, even now as a senior consultant, that sense of being ordinary is frequently interrupted by events which emphasise how much I am considered different in surgical spaces. The way we have to make special requests to get equipment that's sized for us. The way patients will ask me to thank their surgeon. Not realising that I am their surgeon. The way that my title is omitted in conference programs, even when other colleagues are appropriately addressed as doctor or professor. As I've become more senior and become an educator and then become involved in the work of addressing professional competencies in the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons, I've learned that what Claire did is actually supported by a great deal of literature. It's not just about feelings. For example, in a simulation study where an actor anaesthetist asked trainees to give blood against a patient's wishes, hierarchy acted as the strongest negative influence on patient safety, trainee learning, and team functioning. And in the St Bart's Nightingale Hospital, near the start of the pandemic, a lack of hierarchy evolved naturally because the emergent nature of the threat meant that no one person could claim to have special knowledge or seniority. And this flexible team structure facilitated communication and rapid knowledge dissemination so that changes to management protocols, and all of you will know how hard it is to change management protocols in fixed hospitals, those changes, which normally take months or even years, occurred within hours or days. Similarly, we know that there are benefits to belonging. A lack of belonging contributes to isolation, emotional distress, and lessened effectiveness. I use the word belonging deliberately because it goes beyond mere inclusion, which is sometimes only a grudging permission to be allowed to be in the room. By contrast, belonging, which is a sense of not just being included but also accepted and valued, requires more deliberate work. It's not just opening the door. It is opening the door, taking the time to introduce that person to others, making sure they can participate in all the activities that they would like to. And not just that, but ensuring that that person could, if they wished, propose a modification to the activities that are going on in that room and be taken as seriously as anyone else who had already been there for some time. In other words, being made ordinary in that space. So if it feels like this would require a lot of work and effort, be reassured that simple actions can be effective. Just as Dame Claire Marks welcomed my crochet with just a few words, my own research about the reasons why women choose to leave surgical training show that simple actions, such as a well-timed cup of tea or some early positive feedback, can have a significant impact. And we can all, each of us, commit ourselves to more deliberately doing those actions for others. But we cannot recruit and retain women in surgery just with a mountain of individual small actions. Larger systemic and cultural changes are also required, and this is one of the reasons I was delighted to contribute to the Kennedy Diversity Review. There have been many excellent pieces of work already initiated since the review, but I would implore the leaders and council of the Royal College of Surgeons, England, to look again at the governance recommendations. There is a moral injury in asking trainees and members and fellows to do these multiple pieces of diversity work, and yet to say that the work is insufficiently important to make the necessary changes in the space where the most consequential decisions are made. It implies that diversity is only a matter of convenience, mere embroidery, when significant changes to the fabric of surgery need to be made. When surgery looks at previous social progress, such as women's suffrage or marriage equality, it looks kindly on organisations who did not wait until they were sure there was wider support, who did not wait until they knew they could more easily go with the flow after others had already taken the same path and received that same social recognition with minimal risk. History instead looks kindly on the organisations who had the moral courage to do the hard things because they are the right thing to do, not because they are the popular thing to do or the thing that requires the vote of the existing hegemony. I would like to think that I have just become a fellow of just such an organisation, but until the governance recommendations of the Kennedy Diversity Review are implemented, I must remain unconvinced. In the meantime, while we wait for that change, note that none of the research I've referred to requires participants with formal leadership roles or qualifications. These are actions that we can all do no matter what our role in the team or level in the hierarchy. I have had opportunities to multiply this evidence across multiple educational courses developed for my college, the Australasian College, and in my various roles in other professional colleges and higher education institutions. But I have had those opportunities because other people have done small actions for me. Perhaps my most impactful piece of work was helping to develop and deliver the educational material for the Operate with Respect program. I am told that in the midst of the discussions in 2015 around the initiating Sentinel event, which related to sexual harassment, in a random room in the college building in Melbourne, Australia, which is 3 hours flight away from where I live on the Gold Coast, someone unnamed said, "What about that woman on the Gold Coast who's always noisy about such things?" So it's only through something so ordinary and so accidental that I've had the privilege of contributing to a program of work that's delivered mandatory universal training to every surgeon, every trainee, and every applicant to training, and every specialist international medical graduate in Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand, and to upskill every surgeon in a leadership position, executive, committee members, selectors, supervisors, and examiners, to better address bullying, discrimination, and harassment in our profession. It is frankly mind-blowing when I consider what can happen when there is a confluence of brave leadership, many people working together, and proper investment of resources. I think the College of Surgeons England has 2 out of the 3. This work is ongoing, but already we have evidence that it's working. The program was launched in 2015, and the Phase 2 evaluation report of the Building Respect program in 2021, 6 years later, shows a significant increase in recognition of what constitutes disrespectful behaviour and a significant decrease in overt disrespectful behaviours such as shouting and inappropriate physical contact. This is not something I could have imagined that I could have achieved when I was a trainee. I was so conflicted between my love of surgery and the punishing hours which made me feel I could not provide care safely in the days before work hours restrictions. And I was similarly conflicted between my desire to help patients and my desire to be there for my own young children in the days before flexible work structures. And I was also conflicted between expressing my compassion through my emotions and being told simultaneously to be more coldly professional and yet to also smile and bake more for the staff. When I think about what got me through my consultancy and what's kept me going through 2 decades of advocacy, I return to those small, ordinary acts. The consultant who made a special request for me to assist him because he needed a more experienced pair of hands. The colleague in a meeting who quiets another member from speaking over me so that I can have my ideas heard. Complete strangers at conferences who smiled at me as I breastfed a fussy baby outside conference rooms. These things showed me I belonged and was valued, but I was lucky that something lovely like that would happen every time I was getting close to feeling so excluded that I was ready to leave surgery. And that happened on many occasions. Many colleagues have not been so lucky. So we need to make these experiences of belonging commonplace if we're going to recruit and retain the best in surgery. So those of us who have been given the responsibility of leadership should work towards larger structural change, even when it may require that we give up some of our own privileges. But all of us can continue the work of doing small acts for others to make them feel ordinary, as though a person being there is exactly where they should be, requiring no additional questions about whether they can have it all, or balance their responsibilities, or are a good fit in a field that has been such a poor fit even for the people who are supposed to fit the stereotype. We cannot claim that we select and train the best for as long as we subject people to bullying, discrimination, harassment, inflexible training, punitive working conditions, and 1,000 other things that have nothing at all to do with competence or excellence. We cannot set up a system where those who have compassion and a balanced life are discouraged from continuing and then wonder why we end up with difficult colleagues and toxic units. We must act on the substantial literature stretching back several decades now that shows us what we must do to create the conditions for delivering the best patient care. So, to conclude, I ask you all to commit to making women in surgery completely ordinary through small acts to welcome and normalise all our wonderful diversity. And because our feminism is not feminism unless it is intersectional, let me also ask you to do the same for people of every race, gender, sexuality, age, ability and class. When we talk about the patriarchy, we talk about a structure that has preferentially benefited cis-hetero, able-bodied white men from privileged backgrounds. And if we only support women without addressing these other dimensions of discrimination, we will only create the feminarchy, identical to the patriarchy in all respects apart from the gender. Women can do it differently. At the risk of resorting to stereotype, women excel in working in teams, balancing multiple competing tasks, and at navigating complex social frameworks. We are ideally suited to bringing the surgical profession into the modern era, and we can choose to bring everyone with us and to create something entirely new. This is our challenge, to create a surgical workforce that reflects the population it serves and that contains enough capacity in its diversity to meet the many unexpected challenges of the past years and to meet as yet unknown future challenges in a rapidly changing world. One that can make everyone, no matter their diversity, feel like they belong. We can make surgery ordinary, not just for women, but for everyone. I thank you for coming today, and I thank you for giving me the opportunity to deliver the International Women's Day address for 2023.
Thank you. That was amazing, as you can tell from that reception. Do we have a roving mic? Thank you. So has anyone got any questions for Professor Liang? Do I? You will have to get back to the phone, yes, because of the microphone.
Because I'm not.
Thank you, and because of online, that's it.
Yes.
Thank you, that was amazing. I just want to ask you a question that I've been asked a few times when I've given presentations about diversity. I do believe there's a place for positive discrimination, but by saying that, I've been called vindictive and divisive. So I'd just be interested to hear your opinion about positive discrimination, please.
Well, there is that saying, you know, to those who have had privilege, equality feels like oppression. So people do feel like they have to give something up. And I think I found it more useful. So I have gone through my radical phase where I was like, just suck it up. All right. But I came to realise that this is a very, you know, if we expect others to listen to us and the hurts and discriminations and to take our feelings seriously, then we must listen to them and take their hurts and feelings seriously as well. Not to say that we shouldn't have positive discrimination, because all the research shows that that is required if you really want to move the needle. But nevertheless, to find a way to move in that direction that acknowledges that they are losing something that they previously took for granted. And I think if we can find some way to navigate that well, some of those people actually become your strongest supporters. Yeah, we've had several, you know, who really, when we started Operate With Respect, I thought, oh dear, they're going to be permanently troublesome. But when you show them that it's not scary, that we're not going to humiliate them or do any of the things, because one of the tenets of Operate With Respect is you can't fix disrespect with more disrespect. So even though it is a very human emotion to kind of think, well, you can just experience all this crap that I had to experience, thank you very much. You know, that's a very human thing, but I think we can be better than that. I think we can be gracious and say, no, we're going to move to this thing where everyone gets treated with respect. So that's my take on it. I mean, can I give a plug for the Royal Australasian College of Surgeons, by the way? So I challenge you to match this. So last week in the council meeting, we gave all our trainee and international medical graduates the right to vote in all our elections. So that will hold us to honesty, I think. We also put in new gender targets. So our 2016 Diversity Inclusion Plan already had gender targets, which we met of 20%, and we are now aiming for 40% male, 40% female, and 20% all genders across our executive, our council, and all our major committees. And the last thing we're going to aim at, which is quite aspirational, I think, considering the gender mix in some specialties, by 2027 we're going to aim for 40% across every specialty women. Wow. And some specialties are already there, but of course some other specialties, such as T&O, will have to do a lot of work if they're going to meet that. I mean, the other thing is the leadership. You know, I made a point about the governance because that is the final piece of the jigsaw puzzle. The data are going to be reported annually by each specialty society, and they are accountable to the CEO of the College of Surgeons. It's, you know, it's made very clear that it is an expectation of the executive that these things be met. So it's not, you know, it's not like some pro bono committee that's going to meet once a month and has no funding. You know, it's like we are seriously investing in it. So just saying, I dare you to match it.
That is
because
fantastic.
We surgeons are not at all competitive, right?
What a challenge. But on that same point regarding quotas, one of the problems is often with the people who are then put in the quota or positively discriminated for, they don't feel they've got there on their own merit. What do you say to that? Because that's often from the women. You say, right, we're going to have 40% women. Those women are there thinking, well, I'm only there because you put me in because I was a woman, I don't deserve to be here. How do we manage that?
Well, there's two sides to it. There's the science and there's the emotion. So the literature shows that people selected on quota are not underperformers. They contribute really well. So that's the first thing you need to know, that there's no evidence that people who get their own quotas perform any differently to the people who didn't get their own quotas. The other thing is to take it away from an individual focus and look at it on a society-wide basis. You're like, we know about the systemic discrimination in society against women and the many ways in which we're discouraged from careers in STEM and then again into medicine and then again into surgery. You know, there's this progressive narrowing of the pipeline where there's fewer and fewer women as you get more senior. So keeping that in mind, if you say that we are selecting quotas and, or maybe I only got there because I was a woman, you're operating from a deficit narrative because you're like, am I less than? The assumption is that you are somehow less than and that you might not be as good as the people who got there outside of a quota. But if you look at it on a wider systemic level, you're like, no, we're better than, because we had to make it through all these barriers and we've come from further behind to get there. So if you consider the quotas as like the absolute gold, you know, shall we mandate the absolute gold? The thing, because there's this gap between the narrative and the perception. The narrative, which is backed up by science, is that diversity is good. Diversity improves organisational performance, it improves team communication, it decreases all your disrespectful behaviours, it improves patient care, it meets patient needs better, blah, blah, blah. Oh, but we can't have quotas. You know, it's like, well, if you're going to say that diversity is a good thing, then quotas should be a good thing because you're actually adding 40%. That's better than what you've currently got, right? Anyway, things to think about. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. Any more questions? One down here at the front.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I thought it was really inspirational. I think you articulated so many things really well. I think I feel really passionately about some of the things you've spoken about, and I think I look around the room and I see a lot of like-minded people. My fear is that the people who need to hear some of these things the most are not in the room. And I just wondered what your thoughts and feelings were on that. And how do we tackle that? How do I combat that?
Well, that's why our college made it mandatory. The Operate with Respect program was mandatory. And oh boy, did I get hate mail for that. As did everyone in our committee, as did all our leadership, like even older male president and vice president, very supportive of the program, but they got lots too. Yeah, so that's one way of doing it. I mean, obviously each college has to make their own decision about whether they have the stomach to mandate a program. The other thing is to actually just not call it diversity or gender. You know, so for instance, I'm speaking later this year in Perth at the RANZCOG, so Royal Australasian New Zealand College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and their final plenary is titled something sort of nondescript, like moving forward into, like where to from here or something like that. And you know, this has to stay within this room because I don't want to blow the cover for the for the conference. But actually, it's about diversity, and all the speakers have been asked not to use diversity in any of their talk titles, because that's the thing. We're going to trick everyone to turning up to this final thing, and then we're going to talk about the thing. Yeah. So you know, I agree. I mean, we do need everyone in the space if we're going to talk about it. But part of the problem is that we haven't yet moved away from sort of diversity 1990s to intersectionality 2023. Men do not understand that they also have diversity, so they think it doesn't apply to them. And I think we have to start correcting that and saying, you know, it's not just about the colour of your skin and what gender you are. Everyone has diversity. And we need all of that diversity in surgery. You can be the whitest, malest, most sort of upper socioeconomic, able-bodied man you like, but you will still have some diversity that is really useful to surgery. You know, this is an everyone discussion. Yeah.
Thank you. Any final questions? Right, Mr. Cossart.
Thank you very much for a brilliant talk, and there's such a lot there that we could sort of go on talking all night. Your point about the ordinariness and bringing it all down and the diversity, getting away from the word diversity, I really applaud and would help everybody to go away, because it just creates immediate sort of antibodies whenever it's used. And I think it's been used so much these days, the antibody is there. My point and perhaps question is, the influence of women on what they should do starts much earlier than actually entering the profession. And they come with that influence in their ideas and their values and what they think they are able to do. What is the next step that you would envisage that we as seniors and mature people in the profession could sort of begin to educate the population and society at large about that issue of starting this from day one of life?
I agree. I have a daughter, and the gender patterning starts incredibly early, even at preschool. And we all have our part to play in challenging those stereotypes. And I actually think the schools do quite a good job of it these days. There's a lot more women in STEM and those sorts of programs around. I think the best thing is getting back to what Professor Mansfield was saying, you know, to be more deliberate about being role models. It's really important that people see us out there. Many of us, we're inspired to do what we do just by one person. You know, like there'd be a sea of men, but you'd have one wonderfully inspiring woman and you'd think, oh, I could do that. Well, that's a really cool specialty. And you might not have ended up in their specialty or doing their particular job, but just seeing someone is incredibly powerful. So I think that's what we can all do. Now, surgery is a very demanding specialty. You know, it always feels like there's never enough hours in the day. And so we have to recognise that doing that sort of role modelling and advocacy work is additional labour. So I don't kind of want anyone to burn themselves out trying to do that, but for anyone who has capacity, I think we can be more deliberate about making sure that we're seen.
Another question?
Surgery appears to have a problem with gender-based violence, and the biggest data set currently in the literature is the Operate With Respect data that talks about sexual harassment, sexual assault, and rape. Specifically to those behaviours, 2 questions. How was it received when you published that data? I can sort of guess. And then how did you overcome those barriers, and how did you try to address that specific problem? Because it's something that this college is taking extremely seriously, but it's always better to learn from people who've been there before.
We went through all 5 stages of Kubler-Ross's grieving, basically. So we published the data. So for those of you who are unaware, the sexual harassment occurred to 30% of our female trainees. And in fact, there was a significant proportion, I think about 8%, who had experienced sexual assault. And 1.1% reported rape within the training relationship, which was horrifying. When we published the data, you know, like I said, it was the 5 stages of grief. You know, there were those who denied it. They were like, it can't be true. You know, it cannot possibly be happening. This is too far from what could be reasonable. And there was anger, and there was bargaining, and, you know, da-da-da. And some people eventually got to acceptance. So there was that. And to some degree, it requires time. It requires time for everyone to wrap their heads around this and slowly turn the boat. You know, we talk about turning the boat in the sea. And as a college, you've got to have the fortitude, as we say, to stick with it for the length of time. So that data I told you about is our data at the 5 and 6 year time point. You know, so this is not something that you do for a 2 or 3 year period and go, oh, done now. We've got to plan to stick with it. On a sociological level, so those of you who know me know that I've got a BA and a sociological background. So we talk about the 2-generation model for behaviour change. So if you think about things like wearing a seatbelt in cars or not smoking in public places such as restaurants, the first generation does it because, you know, they think it's normal, and then they're told that it's not normal and they must stop doing it. So they do it consciously, but only if they're reminded. And it's the second generation coming after them that grows up thinking that putting your seatbelt on in cars or not smoking in restaurants is the done thing. But even after the second generation, you have to do periodic reminders, a bit like vaccine booster shots, you know, because if you just stop, everyone would just go back to smoking in public places and not wearing their seatbelts, right? So it's that longevity, and in surgery we are quite bad at integrating social sciences. The qualitative researchers amongst you will know what I'm talking about. We believe that we are scientifically based and evidence-based, by which evidence we mean numbers, quantitative. But the practice of surgery is just as much art and about humanity and about emotions and feelings and human interactions, and that's where we fall over. That's why we're so bad at doing this culture change, behaviour change stuff. So we need to get better at that and have the humility to borrow from the social sciences and go, okay, there is actual science about behaviour change and how we do it and how long it takes, and commit to using those strategies and sticking at it for the 2 generations as required. And that requires investment. So our college has invested 7 digits, not 6, 7 digits in the Operate With Respect program. Yep, that's the sort of investment that's required. Anyway, yes, so to say, yeah, I don't have any easy answers. The path is always hard, but you have to commit to the hardness of it.
Thank you very much. I think we've got to the end of our hour. And for those people who are lucky enough to be in the room, we can carry on next door and speak to, well, converse amongst ourselves, but also ask any further questions of both Professor Liang and Professor Mansfield. But thank you to everyone who's joined online, and thank you to everyone here. And a final round of applause for our 2 speakers, please.